So I just watched Dune 2021, and I've got some things I want to say about it. Before I get too far in, I just want to say that as I was writing the script, I expect this episode to be a little on the short side, so for those of you who wanted a big, epic, sweeping review of this movie, I'm sorry. Secondly, as usual, this will be made up of a non-spoiler section and a spoiler section, but I expect the spoiler section to take up a larger proportion than I normally do with videos like this, so I recommend that if you care about spoilers, you go watch the movie before watching this video anyway, but rest assured that you will be warned when spoilers are about to start. Last, just like with my Demon Slayer review, this is a review of an adaptation, but unlike with that video, I have actually read the original novel this movie is based on, so I'm probably going to spend more of this video talking about how the movie functioned as an adaptation, rather than as a standalone story. With that all said, let's get started. One thing I want to make very clear right at the beginning is that this movie adapts only the first half of the novel, not the entire thing. This is not something that was made clear in the marketing, as far as I can tell, and while the title card at the beginning of the movie called it Dune Chapter 1, I assumed at the time that Chapters 2 and potentially so on would be adaptations of future books in the Dune series. For those who aren't aware, while the Dune novel can be read as a standalone piece, it is the first book of a 6-book series. While not knowing that this is an adaptation of the first half of the novel didn't affect my enjoyment while I was watching the movie, obviously, because I didn't know that was the case until the credits started rolling, 90% of the things I said about the movie the night that I watched it had to do with how I was disappointed that I didn't know it wasn't a full adaptation, and that I felt like the point it ended at was very awkward and abrupt, and that's probably not what you want people who just watched your movie to say to people who maybe haven't seen it yet and are on the fence. I'll talk more about this in the spoiler section, but for now, this is something I really felt should have been made clear in the marketing, so I'm making it as clear as I can now. Another thing I'd like to talk about relatively early on in this video is Dune's target demographic, or more specifically, how I have to admit that I don't really know what it is. I've seen the phrase Star Wars for adults thrown around a lot in reference to the story, and while yes, it is clearly intended for a more mature demographic than Star Wars, it also contains a lot of tropes that I would expect out of the young adult genre. You know, a teenage protagonist who feels stifled by the role he's being forced to grow up in, and who discovers a shocking secret about his heritage and winds up becoming basically the most important person in the universe. Also, to call the main villain cartoonishly evil would be an understatement. Don't get me wrong, I know that there are people out there who would and probably do engage in a lot of the kind of despicable behaviors as Baron Harkonnen, but with how much emphasis I had heard this series placed on politics and philosophy before I started reading, he came off a lot less nuanced than I expected. I know a lot of people are really going to hate me for saying this, but Dune bears a lot of surface level similarities to James Cameron's Avatar, enough that I would be totally unsurprised to find out that Dune was a primary inspiration for that film. Don't get me wrong, I think Dune pulls off much of it a lot better than Avatar, but frankly, Avatar really is the same story with more technology and done a little bit worse. However, to circle back to my original point about this feeling like a really long YA novel, that point is undermined by the protagonist seemingly trying to fight against these tropes for a lot of the story, but not for all of it. Add to that how many stories I've heard about people really connecting with the book as teenagers, and I'm tempted to call Dune a sort of transitionary piece between YA and adult fiction, and to say that the target demographic is teenagers who think it's adult fiction, aka people who don't know that they're in the target demographic. Now, bear in mind that almost all of what I just said is totally dependent on the YA fiction climate in the 1960s when the novel was originally published being relatively similar to what it is today, and I have absolutely no idea if that's the case. I'm also not counting that as either a positive or a negative for the book or the movie, just an observation I thought was interesting. With that largely nonsensical ramble out of the way, let's talk about the Dune movie as an adaptation. First of all, the movie is visually stunning. I feel like I say that for just about every movie I talk about in this series. I'm sorry, I'm just not very good at visual artistic critique. The director, whose name I'm not going to try to pronounce for fear of insulting him, was obviously very concerned with giving the whole experience a grandiose sense of scale, and absolutely succeeds. Many scenes earlier in the film, especially those that take place on Caladan, feel almost comically extravagant to me, but I guess that's just the sort of architecture and spacecraft you can expect out of a capitalist nightmare future where people are rich enough to own entire planets. Once the story starts to get going more, the focus of the grand lens is shifted towards showing off the immensity of Arrakis' desert, and there I feel it is much more welcome. There are also some really phenomenal performances in this movie. I especially thought that Jason Momoa as Duncan Idaho and Rebecca Ferguson as Lady Jessica were really good. But this movie really made me realize how passive of a character Jessica actually is. Don't get me wrong, I could already tell in the book that she had nowhere near the kind of presence I expected out of the protagonist's mother, especially when she's gone through the kind of training that she has. But in the movie, it was especially clear to me that Lady Jessica has virtually no character agency whatsoever. However, since that's something taken from the source material, I'm not going to hold it against the movie. A couple other small notes on adaptational changes. Liette Kynes is a woman in the movie, which caught me a bit by surprise. I went back and checked later, and Kynes is definitely a man in the book, but there are so few female characters in the book, and Kynes' gender literally doesn't affect the plot at all, so this is the kind of adaptational change I can totally get behind. However, I didn't like how the movie portrayed the voice. The impression of the voice I got from the book was that it was a manipulation of someone's instincts, giving an order with such an air of authority that the target instinctually carries it out before their mind can process what's going on. At one point in the movie, Paul uses the voice on a Harkonnen, and the Harkonnen stands still and stares at him for a full second or two before slowly turning around to obey him. This feels like straight up mind control, and that made it a lot harder for me to suspend my disbelief. I am totally willing to accept that this is a case of me just misinterpreting what the book was going for, but that doesn't change the fact that it did negatively affect my opinion of the movie, albeit in a very small way. Finally, I don't know if this was the fault of the movie or just the theater I saw it in, or some combination of the two, but when this movie is loud, it is super loud, like painfully loud. I think that might be largely due to the movie, since during the more dialogue-heavy moments, the volume was reasonable, but I've only seen it the once, so I can't say that conclusively. Honestly, that's about all I had to say in the non-spoiler section. As I said before, the movie is only an adaptation of the first half of the book, and during the spoiler section, I will not be spoiling anything that happens in the book past the end of the movie. So if you have only seen the movie and haven't read the book and want to go into the second movie blind, this video is safe. However, if you haven't seen the movie or read the book and you want to go into either one blind, now's the time to turn off the video. I'll give you a few seconds to do so. I expect that there's at least a few people who have stuck around, not because they have already seen the movie, but because they have no intention to. If you do belong to that group, first of all, thank you. I'm quite honored that you find my content entertaining enough to watch a review of a movie you don't care about. But secondly, let's do a quick summary of what actually happens in this movie to catch you up to speed. So, we're way off in the distant future, and the galaxy is in empire now, because of course it is, and there are a bunch of feuding noble families, because of course they are, and some of them control entire planets, and there's this stuff called spice that's a super addictive drug, and also integral for interplanetary travel, but can only be found on a planet called Arrakis, known to the natives as Dune. Arrakis was, until very recently, ruled over by the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, who was super nasty and evil and exploitative, but by command of the Emperor, it has just been handed over to the Duke Leto Atreides. The Duke has a concubine named Jessica, who is his wife in all but name, and Jessica belongs to a religious order called the Bene Gesserits. You can think of them as basically superpowered nuns, but without the celibacy. The Bene Gesserits have been working for thousands of years to do a human version of selective breeding to produce a male Bene Gesserit who can see the future, and Jessica thinks that her son Paul, who is the main protagonist, might be this man. Duke Leto has also been training Paul to be a Mentat, which is a royal advisor who is basically a human computer, but that's not really focused on much in the movie. And Paul is also next in line to become the Duke of House Atreides, so he has a lot riding on his shoulders, but he's not really convinced that that's where he wants his life to go. Anyway, House Atreides moves to Arrakis to take over the spice mining, but not too long after they settle on the planet, we find out that the Harkonnens and the Emperor are in an alliance, and turning Arrakis over to House Atreides was actually part of a plot to wipe out the Atreides bloodline. So, a traitor in House Atreides turns Leto over to the Harkonnens to be executed, and a bunch of Imperial troopers land on Arrakis and start mowing down the Atreides military, and basically only Paul, Jessica, a military commander named Duncan Idaho, and the Imperial ecologist Liet Kynes, who is more loyal to the planet's native population than to the Emperor, so she likes the Atreides a lot more than Harkonnens, make it out alive. They make it out to Dr. Kynes' secret research base and find out that the natives have been slowly terraforming Arrakis to make it less desert-y, but then the Imperial military catches up to them, and Idaho and Dr. Kynes die, buying time for Paul and Jessica to escape, and the two meet up with some natives and convince them to take them in, but one of the natives doesn't like that and challenges Paul to a duel, and Paul wins, so they go off to with the natives, and bam, movie over. So, here's the part that I admit I went through that whole story explanation largely to illustrate how abrupt I find the end of the movie. Like I said, I didn't know until the credits started rolling that this was only a partial adaptation, and I genuinely spent the first 30 seconds or so of the credits staring at the screen, mouth hanging open, thinking, wait, that's it? That's where it ends? So yeah, it's safe to say that my biggest problem with this movie was the ending. I really felt like it failed to come to a satisfying climax to the first part of the story. However, I recognize that Dune is a really long book, so any movie that attempts to adapt the whole thing in one go is either going to be absurdly rushed or absurdly long, and neither of those is going to be particularly appealing to general audiences. I'm sure a lot of the fans of the book wouldn't have minded a 4.5 hour movie, but remember what a big deal it was when they announced that Avengers Endgame was going to be 3.5 hours? The majority of the audience for this movie is likely going to be people who haven't read the book, and something like 4 hours is a really long time to ask someone to devote to a movie that they don't know if they're going to be invested in. My point here is that I think splitting this into multiple movies was a smart move, but I didn't like that that wasn't in the marketing, and I didn't like where they put the gap. So I'm going to be a little bit selfish here and spend the last part of this review explaining how I would have done it if I was in charge. Hear me out, Dune movie trilogy. I'm not a producer or anything like that, so I don't know if the return on investment would be able to justify a third movie, but from an artistic standpoint, I am really convinced that this would have been the best way to go. See, the book is already split into 3 parts, with the attack on House Atreides as the climax of part 1, meaning that this movie, as you might expect, ends about halfway through part 2. The movie cuts or skims over a lot of what happens in part 1, so I highly doubt that it would have been difficult to get another 30 to 45 minutes of content out of it. For example, my favorite scene in the movie is a dinner party hosted by House Atreides that almost goes full-on Death Note with the kind of mind games everyone is playing with each other. As much as I hate to see it go, I do think that if anything substantial from part 1 had to be cut, it should have been that, but dang would I have loved to see it adapted. There's also a subplot running through part 1 where House Atreides figures out that there's a traitor among them, and the Harkonnens are seeding information to implicate Lady Jessica, and some people fall for it and some people don't, and all that was pretty much completely absent from the movie, which really has me concerned for the fate of my second favorite scene that happens in the book after the movie ends and is the culmination of that particular subplot. I also think that the scene in the still tent between Paul and Lady Jessica right after they escape, where he yells about being a freak, which was one of the very last scenes in part 1, was a lot more impactful in the book, as, if memory serves me correctly, that's when Paul really starts to manifest his future vision in earnest, and also realizes that Jessica is a Harkonnen by birth, which means that he himself is a combination of 2 different noble houses that have always hated each other, so him calling himself a freak just feels like it has a lot more weight behind it in that context. But I digress. Another potential benefit to expanding to 3 movies instead of 2 would be to rectify my biggest issue with the book, the pacing of part 3. Without going into any specifics, a lot of stuff that feels like it should be incredibly significant just kind of happens without a lot of fanfare, and by that point it felt to me almost like the book itself just wanted to be over. I think giving part 3 an entire movie to itself could have helped give all that a little bit more breathing room. It's possible that the pacing will be a bit more to my taste in the second movie anyway, but I'm not going to hold my breath. Besides, this isn't really something that I've heard many people talk about, so it might just be a personal problem, in which case I can't really blame the movie even if it does rush through all that. However, a slightly bigger concern I have is that in the book there's a 2-year time skip between parts 2 and 3, and I'm worried that's going to feel really awkward and maybe a little bit jarring right smack in the middle of the second movie, but it's unfair to judge the sequel prematurely. I do understand to some degree why they made the decision to split it into 2 movies instead of 3, especially from a financial standpoint. Making 3 movies is going to be an entire movie more expensive than making 2, and judging by the target release window for the second movie, it's been in production since well before the first movie released, and I'm sure selling a single sequel to executives who haven't seen how the first movie is going to perform yet is a lot easier than selling 2. Also, action sequences are very front heavy in part 2, with most of part two's second half being mostly made up of more subdued character moments, so I could see people on the production team being worried that the end of part 2 would have been unsatisfying to a lot of moviegoers, but you already know my thoughts on the end of the movie that actually got made, so that argument doesn't work particularly well for me. Whatever the reason, it seems that Dune is releasing as 2 movies instead of 1 or 3, so who knows? Maybe I'll see you back here in the fall of 2023 with a review of part 2. With the way my production schedule looks, that might just end up being the next episode of So I Just Watched. Either way, until that next episode rolls around, I've been Brainy Diode, and I want you to know that claiming that I still haven't come up with a good outro for this series has, in fact, become the permanent outro for this series. Yep, that's how I'm ending it.